For joining the Southern New Mexico New Progressives today for a PRC candidate forum. I'm going to give a brief overview of the PRC and then we'll get into the questions after explaining some of the rules. The PRC is important from how clean the air you breathe to how much we pay utility companies. The PRC regulates and has jurisdiction over consumer issues relating to transportation, such as billing issues for towing companies, ambulances, limousines, and taxis. Also, motor carrier registration within the state. The enforcement of state and federal regulations regarding oil and natural gas pipeline safety. Oversight of utilities such as natural gas, propane, investor-owned water and sewer, electric companies and electric cooperatives. Moving companies traveling within the state, and the State Fire Marshal Office, which oversees the administration of the Fire Training Academy. Fire service support, arson investigations, and code enforcement. The unauthorized billing or switching of carriers for utilities managed under the Telecommunication Bureau. The regulation of rates, quality of service, and billing issues for local, competitive, and inmate phone companies, such as CenturyLink, QC, and Windstream. The PRC also assists customers with wireless marketing and billing complaints or wireless cellular providers, but has no jurisdiction over rates, terms, or quality of service. Limited roles such as billing not to include rate or service for resellers of calling cards and interstate long-distance carriers. So we will not be taking questions from audience members unless we have extra time at the end. However, you will have an opportunity to ask the candidates questions in one-on-ones at the end of the meeting. We flipped a coin to determine the order of tonight's forum. Candidates will be given up to 3 minutes for their introductions, beginning with Sandy Jones, and then we'll lead directly into tonight's 10 questions. Each candidate will be timed, and I will be giving them a 30-second warning to let them know that they're getting to the end of their time. There will be one 2-part question that permits up to a 4-minute long answer, and the other 9 questions will allow up to 2 minutes for the candidates to answer. So I'm going to use a timer on my phone. So to begin, Mr. Sandy.
Just real quickly though, one member of the audience was just waving. She was having trouble hearing.
Yes.
So
Okay.
I'm going to try and speak up. Can you hear me now, Tammy? Is that good? Okay.
That's what Verizon said.
Can you hear me now? That's right.
So when you're ready for your introduction, Mr.
Thanks. One other thing that PRC does do, we train the first responders for the whip route, so that's an important piece that we have for those of you who are concerned about the nuclear waste facility. My name's Sandy Jones. I want to thank you for hosting us here today. It's very important that we have this opportunity to talk to folks about our job and what we do and give you the opportunity to decide whether or not to send me back or my opponent. I'm currently the chairman of the Public Regulation Commission. I have been for the 2nd year in a row now, and I've worked really hard to bring back some unity to the commission, bring back some dignity, and we've tried to stay out of the newspaper a little bit over this last year or 2 or 3, and we've been successful doing that. You know, most everybody knows what the governor does, or your legislator, maybe the AG, the state auditor, Supreme Court, but not many people really understand what the PRC does. That may be by design, but the truth is that our policymakers, our legislators, our governor sets a policy for the world for New Mexico, and the PRC is really the regulator. We're the enforcer of the policy for the monopolies in the state. And I hope we get into a little bit more of that today, because it's important during the campaign to understand really what the role of each job is, and I hope to be able to answer some more of that today. There is a big difference, and again, I will say there's a big difference between a legislator and a policymaker and the regulator. We try to enforce the policy that is set forth by the governor in the state of New Mexico. It is really very important in the commission role that as a commissioner that you go in a fair and balance. Our role constitutionally and statutorily is to balance the interest between the monopolies and the consumer. And that can be very difficult. You have to have the law behind you in all the decisions you make, and that's what we try to do, at least under my tenure. I want to get quickly into a few of the accomplishments. I hope I don't burn up the entire time, but since being on the commission this time, I worked hard to work with the legislature provide some technical service to modernize the Telecommunications Act. In fact, we've set up a fund now for broadband deployment in unserved and underserved areas. I think a very, very important piece. How are we doing on time?
Hit 30 seconds.
Okay, just this year, we've approved probably 1,300 megawatts of renewable energy. I have an order this coming week to approve another 965. We work to get the Facebook expansion in Los Lunas, $1 million a month in gross receipts to the village of Los Lunas, and they've announced $1 billion in expansion. Close enough?
Yes.
All right,
Okay,
I'll
great.
quit there.
Finish it, sentence?
No, that's fine.
Okay, and then, so, Mr. Steve Fishman.
My name's Steve Fishman. I'm running for the PRC because, in my opinion, it's failing to adequately protect consumers. Sandy's absolutely correct when he says the job of the PRC is to treat both consumers and monopoly utilities fairly. My contention would be is that the way the PRC is operating now, the playing field is heavily tilted towards the monopoly utilities. And we need to do a much better job of getting the consumer voice heard. It's important really in every aspect of our lives. There's probably about 25 to 30,000 folks who have their power shut off annually because they can't afford to pay their power bills. In many cases, it costs them hundreds of dollars to get reconnected. And these are low-income, poor folks. It's a real burden on them when utility prices are high, particularly electric prices. And I think it's a real drain on our economy. I think we've all heard from the VITA, local economic development agencies, that high power costs are one of the main reasons new businesses don't come to New Mexico, choose not to. I see two main problems at the PRC. One of them is strategic. I see an agency that responds one at a time to dockets that are brought up by utilities, doesn't seem to step back and take a strategic view. And it's really important to have a strategic context for what you're doing and what the future looks like. If I spend my life studying French and then it turns out I'm traveling to China, well, that doesn't help me much. And that's kind of what's happening, I feel, at the PRC. How much time? Dynamic new technologies are really taking over, particularly the electric generation field. The second huge interest, and by the way, that costs us potentially billions and billions of dollars, and we lose opportunities to preserve the environment when we're not looking forward and planning. I think the second issue is we just don't have the expertise and competence in the PRC to make the right decisions. Sound management practices are not in place. The only time issues seem to get raised is when outside interveners raise a problem that never seems to happen from staff. We're spending $12 million a year on these folks. We expect them to protect us and not them to rely on us to raise the issues. And very seldom do I see PRC staff actually raise an issue when there's a problem with one of the monopoly utilities. So anyway, we'll go from there, and I look forward to all the questions coming up.
Thank you. So the first question is going to go to Mr. Fishman, and you have 2 minutes to respond to the following questions. The PRC is not fully staffed because of the large number of vacancies, including an 18% vacancy rate under the fire marshal. What do you believe is the cause of this, and what needs to be done to fill these vacancies?
In talking to staff and people at the PRC, you hear a lot about the budget, and there are budget constraints. Sandy will probably know about those better than me about what it does to the specific staff positions. But I will say there are certainly significant morale issues. And we know there are morale issues because there was a study done last year by the National Regulatory Research Institute, which is basically comprised of expert regulators from the National Regulator Association. It's called NAREC. They found severe morale issues. They found severe issues around training and adequacy of training. They found severe issues about people feeling respected and heard in the workplace. They found issues around people feeling there was lots of favoritism in the workplace. Unfortunately, the study was done, and I have yet to find any evidence that anyone responded to it. And in fact, when I'm told by one commissioners, they brought it up that they should do some actions on this study from May 2017, and the commission and Sandy declined to do that follow-up. And in fact, I have an IPRA request in to find out if there was any response at all to a study which basically said, gee, we're not sure that this agency is capable of doing its job.
5 seconds.
So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. And Mr. Jones, would you like me to repeat the question?
Sure.
The PRC is not fully staffed because of the large number of vacancies, including an 18% vacancy rate under the fire marshal. What do you believe is the cause of this, and what needs to be done to fill these vacancies?
So that's really an excellent question. When the PRC was established, years ago, there was a corporation commission, then became a PUC, and then a PRC. And in that process, and I'm talking in the 70s, the then commission chief of staff pointed out to the legislature that when that change came place, those supposed efficiencies were going to come into place, that the agency was over $1 million short in being able to fund the agency appropriately. That has never recovered since the 70s to fully fund the agency. We're probably 250 people short of the agency. We have experienced approximately 8 or 9 years. Our budget was cut when I was on the first term of my commission, 32%. It continued to decline by the legislature to not to fully fund the agency. And it is true. Right now today, if you think it isn't a tough place to work, we do not have an ASD director. These are statutory requirements. ASD director, the utility director, a CRD director, and the general counsel. Those are severe deficiencies. I made it my work to get back to the legislature, work with the legislature, and tell them the things that we need. As a result of my work, we received a 9% bump in our budget this year. So we're going to start down, how much?
30?
We're going to start down that road. I really want to address this NRI report. If you read the report, it was commissioned by the legislature, and the preamble of the report directly said that this report was not to be anything but critical of the Public Regulation Commission. I don't stand behind the report, and it's simply a false statement to say that it was ever asked of the commission to do anything or address the report. We used the report to make the measures that I think you'll see us put in place.
Thank you. So beginning this question with Mr. Sandy Jones. Please make a statement regarding the El Paso Electric Company's proposal to install a major substation in Talavera.
That's an excellent question, and one that the county commission certainly brought up. These are 1 minute or 2 minutes? County commission, understand, passed a resolution recently talking about what we call 440 filings. 440 filings are any investor or rural electric cooperative files with the commission their intent to build any infrastructure, transmission or distribution projects, which would be a substation, alert the commission prior to their construction. In that subject check, I think it's anything over $400,000 or at least $500,000. So currently, the T&D infrastructure development in the state of New Mexico right now is probably about $280 to $300 million a year. P&M's last check was about $165 million. We have one cooperative on the east side of the state that's already has $65 million under construction today. So those filings are there. In this particular case, is my understanding that a petition came around and was sent to my office, and it was asking the PRC to look at something that a 440 filing has never been filed. So it was in essence asking for a preemptive strike. We don't have the staff or the ability to take care of the 440 filings that are filed now, yet alone to go out and look at other projects that aren't. So I would suggest that it appears that the complaint was twofold. One, they didn't like the substation being built in their area, and second was that there may or may not have been a need for it. So I would suggest that the county commission maybe take a look at the zoning part of it, and that may be a more appropriate place to address that part. The utility, after it's built, has to come to us for recovery of that cost. I don't think many utilities would spend 20 or 30 million unless they understood that they were going to be able to recover that.
Okay, thanks. And Mr. Fishman, would you like me to repeat the question?
Please.
So please make a statement regarding the El Paso Electric Company's proposal to install a major substation in Talavera.
First of all, I have to say I was behind that petition, pointing out that they were building a substation, planning to build a substation, yet the community has no evidence that the substation is needed. The PRC typically does not ask for any evidence that it's actually needed on the 440s that are submitted. Beyond that, there's been huge movement forward in the industry that allow utilities to address distribution problems, electricity distribution problems, without building new substations and without building new power lines. Their energy efficiency and energy storage is rapidly becoming more affordable. It has less impact on the community. In many cases has much lower cost. It's been done in New York and with Con Ed. It's been San Diego Gas and Electric is doing it. It's been done with Bonneville Power in the Pacific Northwest. And even in Arizona, they're doing some of this stuff, and they're not the most forward-looking oftentimes in these technologies. So our question was, boy, before we make the community suffer with a not very attractive facility in the middle of an expensive residential area, why aren't we doing an evaluation? Staff is one problem, but the PRC has the ability to require utilities to submit that
30
information
seconds.
without staff having to do all the research. PRC has to get a lot smarter and a lot more proactive about requiring utilities to provide the appropriate information and making them do the work. They are understaffed at the PRC, but we can work a lot smarter if the PRC decides to take charge of rulemaking, policy, and the dockets. And that's work that really needs to be done.
Thank you. Mr. Fishman, the next question begins with you. Do you recommend any changes to pipeline safety in regards to either the standards or enforcement measures?
I, quite honestly, have not delved deeply enough into the pipeline issues to give you an informed answer on that. I've heard pipeline folks talk with pride about being one of the more professional units within the PRC. It's great to see them have that pride. I will point out that the pipeline unit, unlike some of the other units at the PRC, is not dependent entirely on legislative funding. They, as I understand it, can draw upon certain fees from the folks they regulate that operate the pipelines. It's something that probably we should be looking at for many aspects of the PRC, as I believe in over 40 states, that's one of the ways that we fund utility regulatory agencies. And that might take some of the pressure off in terms of having the right staffing and personnel, and having the right financing to do it. Because I do sympathize with what Sandy's had to deal with in that area. I just think we can be a little smarter about how we address it.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, would you like me to repeat the question?
No, the Pipeline Safety Bureau is obviously a very good part of PRC. I was there when we formed the 811 calls. It's the place where if you're going to dig in the yard or dig in the street, you call, it's 811. We're instrumental in getting the 811 number put in place. It's dependent on federal funds, And we've had a fight at the legislature a time or two getting our fees in place to properly fund it. The feds dictate the amount of service that you have to put out. Of course, New Mexico has led the way in the 811 call centers and is really the poster child of the nation for that success. It's just a great program, and I'm really proud to have been there at the inception when we were putting that together. But on the financing side of the agency, our agency is funded by fees through the utility division, utility taxes. The problem is, like gas tax and some others, those funds are diverted. Steve was there when that stuff was being diverted and not funding. And so we've offered up, and we're going to be working in the interim, a piece that puts the agency back more to an enterprise agency. And let me give you an example. If the PNM or an El Paso of the world wants to file a multi-hundred millions of dollars worth of rate case, the filing fee is $25. If you as a citizen want to file a complaint at the commission, the filing fee is $25. We don't think that's the right fee. I think the filing fee in a rate case should be somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000. That lets us properly litigate the case. It gets the politics out of the legislature. It gets the politics out of the legislature and lets the PRC stand more independently. We'll be working on that through the interim. I had Senate Bill 8 that was introduced in the special session, and we pulled it during this 30-day session for one reason, because the LFC had found that they were going to give us a bump in the budget. We wanted to take that and prove that up before we asked for more in the interim.
Thank you. So beginning with Mr. Jones, what is your stance on individuals' right to distributed generation? For example, under rate 59, individuals must pay utilities a fee for self-generation. Some say that these are required costs that cover repairs and updates to grid connections. Others refer to this as a solar tax implemented by local investor-owned utilities. Would you in the future support repealing this tax? Why or why not?
Well, if I understand your question properly, the self-generation would be home solar, those kind of things, rooftop solar. There's obviously a cost to the utility on the interconnects. Those standards have to be made in order to protect the rest of the grid. One of the things that I think that is really important not to forget, we talk about consumer protections and we talk about pricing, but there's really four cornerstones of what we should be looking at. And every commission in the country and this is really what it is, should be safe, reliable, affordable, in the public interest. And so part of those things in the reliability side, we need to make sure that anybody connects to that grid is done at a standard that protects the rest of the grid and the rest of the consumer. I sit on the National Critical Infrastructure Committee, and cybersecurity has gotten to a new high. I get security briefings a couple of times a year with clearances, and we know that cybersecurity is an issue. Every time you attach to the grid, every time someone makes a connection, there is certainly that potential problem. I don't necessarily see it as a tax. There is a cost. The utilities have to review it. I don't think we should do things that would discourage rooftop solar, and I don't think that we have. I don't think we've let it get excessive at this point. But we certainly need to keep it under control. And I also killed the solar tax, the standby charge in the last El Paso electric rate case, so for what that's worth.
Thank you. Mr. Fishman, would you like me to repeat the question?
Yeah, please.
What is your stance on individuals' right to distributed generation? For example, under rate 59, individuals must pay utilities a fee for self-generation, also known as rooftop solar. Some say that these are required costs that cover repairs and updates to grid connections. Others refer to this as a solar tax implemented by local investor-owned utilities. Would you in the future support repealing this tax? Why or why not?
As we pointed out earlier, it's the job of the commission to review all of the evidence and make decisions. And until I've been involved in a process when we see all the evidence brought forward, it's impossible to say an answer or state an exact position. But I can tell you how it should be evaluated. And there are costs to individual solar installations, but there are also benefits. And in reviewing this issue, we need to look at both. And there's a lot of politics where people talk one or the other. I can tell you there are utilities such as Austin Electric and others that pay people to put up solar. Or you can go to San Antonio and their utility, they pay people to put solar on their roofs. So obviously there's some very different evaluations and ideas about whether it actually costs utility money or saves utility money when you do those individual solar installations. So my belief is that it's probably situational. In some situations it saves costs, in other maybe not. But that all has to be reviewed carefully. I think the idea, until there's a careful study done of how it impacts grids, the idea of imposing a fee is probably not a good idea until we've done all the correct study on it. I will say that it can, to the extent that it saves money, that's one of those tools that can save us money on new distribution and generation investments, because it reduces the need to generate, distribute power, because the power is already at the homes.
Thank you. So beginning with Mr. Fishman, this next question touches on two different subjects, and there's still 2 minutes for this question. With the telecom regulatory oversight that the agency has, can the PRC guarantee net neutrality protections in the state of New Mexico? Would this be a good or bad idea in your view? And what can the PRC do to ensure our electric infrastructure remains safe from cyber attacks?
My understanding is that when it comes to issues like net neutrality, that it's very difficult to control from the PRC. I'd like to think the PRC would bring some policy ideas through research and through its staff to the legislature to address those issues in whatever manner that it can. I know some states have tried some interesting stuff in California and elsewhere to get around the new regulations that have been put in place at the federal level. And so I think when you're talking about that issue, the best that the PRC can be is positive actors in pointing out what the benefits may or may not be to telecom customers. I do think we've got this fund that's been set up to help spread more access, and access is the biggest issue for all telecom and broadband users, particularly in Mexico. And it's great that we have that. It's not nearly sufficient. And there are lots of issues that are coming up that are making implementation difficult because of the recent change in federal regulations.
45 seconds.
So there's a lot to sort out there.
The second half on cyber attacks.
Pardon?
And then
The second half on cyber attacks. I am not a cyber attack expert. The more we link up everything, the more at risk we are. And I think we've got a lot of policy issues to look at about how linked in we want to be, what kind of security we want to put. But again, I wouldn't call myself an expert until on that particular issue until I've sat through a couple of cases and seen the testimony.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Jones, would you like me to repeat the question?
That's net neutrality in cyber.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm going to back up and get the cyber first. Commissions typically aren't running cases on cybersecurity because most all of this stuff is confidential. When FERC recognized that there were problems with reliability, when we saw massive outages in the Northeast and we saw some of those things happen, FERC demanded that every utility have an independent agent that worked on reliability issues, and now they've taken it into cyber issues. And they formed a private entity called NERC. And NERC is really the ones that keep utilities. They're the third-party reviewer on all of this stuff. I can tell you that I'm leading the way on the cyber issue in New Mexico. I've convened all of the major utilities. We've talked about cyber, and let me tell you why it's so important for us to talk about it. I don't necessarily want to know who's attacking. Relief for the cost. So we need to have pieces in place that we have a check mark system where we know that the utility is doing the right thing, and when they come in and ask us for recovery on those costs, that we can rest assured that those are in place. I took part in a tabletop exercise at the War College when I was on the commission before. That was 9 years ago. And there was 148 confirmed attacks on United States utilities at that time. Currently today, there's over 500 attacks on the utilities daily. So that's how big cyber issue is. Net neutrality, let me get back to that. Net neutrality is a federal preemption. We're going to see how that works. Our Attorney General has joined with other Attorney Generals to fight that in court. Everybody's seen this administration and how they're going to treat states. Federal Communications Commission isn't necessarily our friend on that right now.
Thank you. Beginning with Mr. Jones, do you support increasing and enforcing a higher renewable portfolio standard in New Mexico? What percentage of renewables do you think we can reach in either 2035 or by 2050? And what role should utility companies play in investments for battery storage and energy efficiency?
Okay, so let me just start with battery storage and energy efficiency first. As some of you may know, we have now made it part of the resource plan, integrated resource planning for battery storage to be part of that planning process. That's put in, Commissioner Hall and I worked on that to get that put into rulemaking. Battery storage is not anywhere close to being affordable today. There's really only one storage piece that is reliable and is getting close to some affordability, and that's pump storage or hydro storage. We see that with hydroelectric projects, and there are now some projects that have pump storage where you pump water into a reservoir during the off-peak hours and discharge it in the peak hours. And we have to look at that delta at only the very highest peak. Those projects are only affordable if they're very big, very large. So individual utilities have a very tough time paying for that type of project. So the only way that it could conceptually work is a very large project built and multiple utilities take part in that delta right there. We're at the very top. The second part of the question was renewable standards. So we are making what I think is some great inroads in renewables. I think the market's driving renewable as fast as policy right now today. We see where rural electric cooperatives are already at 30%. We see SBS at one time had 53% through wind and renewable. I think it's really the call of the utility. It's not our commission that decides that. That is a policy piece that comes from the legislature, much like many municipalities may want all green energy. I think that's their right and their demand to do that. At the commission, I believe that it's our role to enforce that policy.
Thank you. Mr. Fishman, would you like me to repeat the question?
Please do.
Do you support increasing and enforcing a higher renewable portfolio standard in New Mexico? What percentage of renewables do you think we can reach in either 2035 or by 2050? What role should utility companies play in investments for battery storage and energy efficiency?
So I'm going to start from the top. I have a fundamental disagreement with Sandy on this one. Whereas Andy says it's up to the utility to decide how much renewables they have. And I would argue that over the past 10 years, the PRC has actually been complicit with utilities in quashing the adoption of renewables in New Mexico. And that the standards they've set up for evaluating renewables and the cost of renewables have been inaccurate and misleading and put a drag on our progress towards adopting renewables. In terms of affordability of renewables and storage, what I see is recent quotes for Colorado for new power production that are showing solar plus storage at almost 50% less than building a new gas-powered facility. So the market should be driving this. The commission and utilities have a legal responsibility to install the least cost method of generating and providing power. We should be building primarily renewables if that's the case. It's going to, I think as a commissioner, it's important to be looking at the balance and the financial evaluation to get the least cost while taking care of the environment. But I have to say, it's looking like the market is pushing towards renewables. In deregulated jurisdictions where there's competition between power generators, coal and nuclear can't compete. They have to be subsidized. They cannot compete with renewables. And gas has now reached the same level. So I think we need to move forward on renewables as quickly as we possibly can. Storage absolutely is affordable in many situations now. And in many cases, storage, and Talavera might be one of those instances, putting a small energy storage in versus putting in a big substation can be a big cost saver if we just have enough imagination to understand we can approach these problems differently than we have in the past.
Okay, and this next question, beginning with Mr. Fishkin. How would you deal with corruption in this office and the possibility of others pressuring you for political gains through lobbying efforts and donations, including in-kind contributions?
You know, integrity is hard to enforce. I guess there was if the legislature always passing these, oh, we'll do training, we'll do this or that. If you're a crook, you're a crook. If you're not a crook, you're not a crook. You have to have people with integrity. You have to have people who are willing to do oversight on processes. So I look at one recent decision that was made at the PRC that for me raises a big question mark. Did the PRC kind of lose sight of its direction? And it sounds great, new renewable put in place by PNM. Problem is, the cost is 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, gee, Austin Energy just put in similar kinds of resources at 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Colorado got all of these bids that are, again, almost 50% lower. I love putting in renewables, but why did we end up taking this high-cost bid? And why is it that New Mexico customers don't deserve the same low prices as Colorado or Texas? What were the forces that went on there? I don't know. I know that the utility felt it could make more profit with the with the option that was selected. But I also know that the PRC should have been in a position to know what the national markets were looking like. And if the cost was higher than the national markets that significantly, they should have gone, time out. We may have gotten bids, but something went wrong with this process. Let's step back and figure it out. Basic, good common sense. And we need to apply that, and when we don't apply it, that's its own form of corruption.
Mr. Jones, would you like me to repeat the question?
Sure.
How would you deal with corruption in this office and the possibility of others pressuring you for political gains through lobbying efforts and donations, including in-kind contributions?
So, you know, when I got back on the commission before, I tried to set up our own ethical board to look at PRC policies and have some portion we've asked the legislature over and over and over to get some kind of an ethical bureau going. It was a failure when Steve was there. It's always been a failure, and no one wants to attack those real strong ethical questions. Those need to be put in place. That said, as a commissioner, you know, we are very much so limited on what we can take from any utility. Lobbying comes on both sides of the aisle. We have environmental groups who are interveners that are in lobbying just as hard as a utility is in these cases, and you have to go to the commission understanding that you're going to look at the facts of a case, and regardless of what happens on the lobbying side, you have to do what's in the record. The reason that I think that the check and balance is there is because if we make the wrong lawful decision, the Supreme Court can overturn it. We're getting pretty successful in not getting overturned at the PRC since I've been back, but I want to address this one statement about the solar piece in PNM's last case. That is just absolutely false. The assertion that was somehow a bad deal. There was 8 bids in there. There was one local company that provided a low bid, and those were for 5 small individual plants along the way that the utility had designed to prevent some additional transmission. And so it's just disingenuous to say that, well, we should have looked at another project at 2 cents or another project over there, when scale matters. It absolutely matters in those cases. And I take an exception on the environmental community because if we continue to stall these projects that we're trying to put in place, we're burning coal and gas and nuclear to replace them. So our vision at the PRC is to put these projects in place. And by the way, this is the same community that were complaining 10 years ago that we should have been putting more solar in when those contracts were 20 cents. Had we gone along with that point of view, then we would have nearly double rates today. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We're putting those things in as they come, and I'm excited about the deployment we're putting in.
So beginning with Mr. Jones, as solar and wind generated electricity becomes cheaper and the coal burning plants become relatively more expensive, do you believe the PRC should make changes to facilitate this transition? Should building solar facilities in areas affected by shutdown coal plants be a priority? And what do you see for the near and long-term future for communities in regards to renewable energy?
So that's a really long question to answer, but first of all, the coal-fired generation in the United States of America is over. There isn't a CEO in the country that's not accelerating the decommissioning of coal plants. New Mexico is no different. El Paso Electric got out of coal last year. They got out of their contracts. They're heavily dependent on gas and nuclear, which I'm not sure is quite the best. I like a diverse package better. But there's no question that coal plants in New Mexico are done. So if we want to build, there's some debate as to whether or not we rebuild that generation in the Farmington area to protect the schools, to protect the jobs up there. And I think we saw a project, some legislation, roll through the legislature in this last session, where they were trying to do something for that. I think the PRC's role is simple. We look at the replacement, which is the cheapest, most affordable generation for the consumer. Now that may be a combination of wind, solar, and gas. I'm not sure what that is, but that has to come at the request of the utility. We know we have a renewable portfolio standard. It's our job to make sure that's happening, and I think you're going to see that the market continue to drive renewables down, and I think that renewables are going to exceed our requirements if no new requirements are put in place for a couple of reasons. One, it makes sense. One, it makes sense. The public wants it, and it's better for the utility to have that. But everyone has to keep in mind this one thing. Every time we have a kilowatt hour of renewable, there has to be some backup for that. So we have to try to figure out how we create that backup, that base load generation for that. And right now, that answer is gas. I'm very concerned about using natural gas plants as the sole backup. Because at a coal mine, you have a stockpile of coal ready to burn in case there's an interruption. With gas, you have a pipeline leading to it. If there's an interruption, you have a gas plant down. So I'm very concerned about this.
Mr. Fishman, yes? As solar and wind generated electricity become cheaper and the coal burning plants become relatively more expensive, do you believe the PRC should make changes to facilitate this transition? Should building solar facilities in areas affected by shutdown coal plants be a priority? And what do you see for the near and long-term future for communities in regards to renewable energy?
That middle sentence, repeat that again.
Should building solar facilities in areas affected by shutdown coal plants be a priority?
I think it's important, number one, regarding the coal plant closures, to try and protect jobs as much as we can and do a transition. I think good governance says you don't try to have big losers and big winners. You try and create solutions where everybody can kind of share in the benefits of that decision. But I think it's a big mistake, as Sandy said, coal is dead. I think it's a big mistake to put yourself in a position of subsidizing or protecting industries that don't have a future. That's a losing proposition for the community that you're talking about, and it's a losing proposition for customers as a whole. I think the big challenge with closing the coal plants, and all of these challenges that come before regulators, is as you make the transition, once you decided to make the transition, who ends up with the most money in their pockets? And I have to tell you, monopoly utilities are there to make money. And they put proposals forward that are there to maximize the amount of money in their pockets. Convenience to customers is their second concern. That's why we have a PRC, to protect customers. So I think there's a lot of work to do to protect customers. Sandy was talking about, oh, well, you know, if we make a mistake, we can always disallow monetary compensation for adding that asset. Utilities get more money when they build more assets. They're guaranteed a 10% return approximately over time historically.
20 seconds.
If you're going to, oh, now I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
When you make these transitions, you have to be certain that it's not, you're not just constructing something that maximizes the utility's profits by allowing them to stockpile assets to make a return. Was there any part of that I missed?
Okay, so beginning with Mr. Fishman, this is the last of the 2-minute questions. What is your position on the efforts to strictly limit natural gas flaring in terms of the environment, economic effects, and the impact on social justice? Is the income the state would receive from capturing these emissions worthwhile as it would add to the oil and gas revenues currently received?
It's flaring or methane escape is very wasteful. I think there's many in the environmental community who believe that natural gas, by the time you look at all the leakage and stuff, is not any cleaner from a climate change perspective than coal. I don't think the final word is in on that. I think we should have efficient ways of running all of our industries. We shouldn't just pass it off when it's something that impacts the environment. It's one of the responsibilities of the agency. Again, I think there's a tendency to look at everything that's a change for the monopoly utilities as something that's inconvenient and expensive. I think many jurisdictions have proven that if you take a strategic look at distribution, transmission, generation as a whole, and put them together with the new technologies that we have for efficiency and for energy storage, if you look at the whole package, there's lots of opportunities to keep it cleaner. Utility costs don't need to go up. They can probably come down. In fact, that's happened in Colorado. And that we can protect communities like Talavera from construction of facilities that basically degrade the quality of life. So I don't know if I answered that question, but I sure said what I wanted to say.
Mr. Jones, would you like me to repeat the question?
Yeah. I might get that opportunity this
Yeah,
time.
you do it. Go for it. That's called a pivot.
What is your position on the efforts to strictly limit natural gas flaring in terms of the environment, economic effects, and the impact on social justice? Is the income the state would receive from capturing these emissions worthwhile, as it would add to the oil and gas revenues currently received?
And I'm gonna have to divert that to the experts in the oil and gas divisions in the state of New Mexico. I don't know those answers, but I can tell you from just a 60,000 foot view, if you're wasting any energy anywhere, it just doesn't make sense. Whether there's a ability to stop that, it's certainly a contributor to greenhouse gas. I would hope that we have people looking at that. It's far beyond our purview, but I do want to say that, and it really doesn't, it's beyond the purview of the commission. I don't know if Steve was trying to get to where we had some reason to be in there or not, but the truth of the matter is, utility is a purchaser of natural gas, a utility is, and they're obligated to buy the best pricing natural gas that they can get. I don't know that they can go beyond that. Their job is to provide at the least cost method. I'm just going to stop there. Maybe we'll have some time to
Okay.
go further.
So for the 4-minute question, I'm going to read it, but I'll also pass it to you just because it's a bit long, and it's, so you'll have 4 minutes to
Is
answer.
that fine?
Not sure. So the 4-minute question. So part 1. Do you believe PNM is entitled to any of the $320 million requested for the early retirement of the 50-year-old San Juan coal plant? Considering that PNM itself has said that continuing to run the plant past 2022 would not be cost effective for the company. Should ratepayers foot the bill for 100% of the amount? Part 2, how can the PRC protect the public from huge decommissioning costs in the future? Do you believe it is fair that solar installations being shut down early have a shorter payback life of 7 to 12 years? Meanwhile, coal has had 85 years in some plants, and nuclear plants such as Palo Verde have several decades to collect decommissioning costs. Is this an unfair incentive for coal, natural gas, and nuclear facilities? So,
Who's going first?
I'm sorry, so it's 10.
Okay, so the first part of the question is PNM entitled to $320 million worth of decommissioning costs? For pretty obvious reasons, I'm not going to opine on that. That's a case that's coming to us. But what I will say is that the utility, the next part was, should they recover 100% of their decommissioning costs? I believe that was the second part of the
Yes.
question. The law is clear. A utility is entitled to 100% of their prudent approved costs. So therein lies the big litigation piece. PNM will tell us I thought it was $350 million that they were floating around the legislature. That's a litigated piece. The law also says they have an obligation, the burden of proof is on the utility. So it's very clear that the utility has to prove that out. I will say that as I look back on some of the traditional cases across the country, most utilities have not been able to prove out 100% of their decommissioning costs. So I think that number is probably somewhat south of the $320 million, and maybe a way south of that $320 million. But as you back up and look at what the coal-fired plants did, the utilities, I assume, acted in some kind of good faith when they asked to put those things in place. Where they got off track, and those plants served customers well. We didn't, 60 years ago, I don't think anybody was thinking that there was a problem with coal-fired generation. But where the utilities began to get off track, they found out that if they could do projects, they were required to do certain projects to clean up the emissions. Those made sense. The EPA said, you got to clean them up. You have a standard that you have to meet. Where the companies got smart was they said, well, we'll do a little bit more. Because that drive to earn that return on equity was there. So most commission says, oh, well, they're trying to do a better job, that's good. And I think that became a feeding frenzy, not just at P&M's place, but across the country. So the commission's been pretty good in the last 4 or 5 years of not allowing 100% of those, what we call imprudent costs. Then what was the very last part of the
So
question?
I'll pause your time. You have a minute and a half left. So how can the PRC protect the public from huge decommissioning costs in the future? And do you believe it's fair that solar installations being shut down early have a shorter payback life of 7 to 12 years? Meanwhile, coal has had 85 years on some plants, and nuclear plants such as Palo Verde have several decades to collect decommissioning costs. And
Yeah.
is it an unfair incentive for coal, natural gas, and nuclear facilities?
So there's 30 states that have put in securitization pieces, which is what we saw in the legislature this last year. Basically, that's just pay up front for the decommissioning, hoping to save 20 or 30% of the decommissioning costs. Those probably would have been prudent a while back. The way we protect the public is this litigated piece. The companies are going to have to come in and prove up those costs. The cases that we've had so far have fallen in the 50% range of the cases that I remember. So the reason that the utilities are going to the legislature asking for that is because they really have been treated fairly, I think, at the PRC, and they were trying to find a way to get a little bit more out of the deal. So the legislature apparently agrees that we were probably doing our job right, and I think that's how we're going to continue to protect them. I haven't seen the numbers of 12 to 17 years on solar facilities for useful lives. I've seen those. Most of the useful lives that we've seen are in the 20-plus range. So, but those would be entitled the same way. I mean, once those are depreciated out, there's not much left as an asset. It should stay out of risk.
Thank you. Mr. Fishman, would you like me to repeat the question? I'm also going to hand it over.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe rather than repeat the whole long thing. So we're down on which question number
So
here?
it's
Oh, down at the bottom.
Yes, so part 1 and part 2. So when you're ready.
Do I believe P&M is entitled to any of the $320 million? I agree with Sandy, that has to be litigated. Historically, that 50% number he said is pretty much correct from what I've seen. Should ratepayers foot the bill for 100% of the shutdown cost? Not necessarily. Again, I think there's a prudence issue here. Have all the investments that have been put in there been prudent? That's why you have a PRC to decide that kind of stuff. I think there is an issue that comes up, though, which is that, and we've seen it in a recent rate case, where some costs were disallowed as imprudent, which is pretty uncommon. That doesn't happen that often, that I've seen. And I think that was probably a really good decision. My issue is that how do those costs get incurred in the first place? There's supposed to be an approval process. And the PRC needs to be proactive and prevent bad decisions from being made. So earlier on, Sandy was talking about utilities deciding on what their power generating and distribution portfolio should be. Well, you know what? We give them entree into our homes, into our bank accounts every month. They have the power, and no one else can do it, to take money out of our bank account every month for us to get a service that we absolutely need to live in the case of electric utilities. Wow, we just gave them a lot of power. Don't we deserve some power in how that gets delivered to us? And I think that it's really important that the PRC take a much more proactive role in looking at how that stuff gets developed. If we did, there'd be a lot less risk of imprudent investments in the first place. And guess what? When you don't make an imprudent investment, that's not just good for the customer, that's also better for the utility. That's called balance. So I think it's really important to have that expertise in place to prevent the bad decision in the first place. And that takes a proactive regulatory regime. And it doesn't have to be complicated. Oftentimes, utilities are very difficult, very opaque to get the correct information on any particular thing. There's a lot we can do in rulemaking to ensure that the right information is in front of people at the right time. It doesn't happen now. Instead, it turns into long litigation that takes up staff time, and quite frankly, it's very inefficient. I don't know exactly how the solution is going to happen. I don't know if it's procedure, rule, or how much might be legislation, but we obviously have to look at all three. How do we protect the public from huge decommissioning costs? We have to do a better job in evaluating upfront before a facility is built what the utility, what the decommissioning risk is. In the case of nuclear, I don't think we have any really good idea of what decommissioning costs are in any particular facility. There's some history, but these are not standardized facilities, so what happens in any given particular case is kind of unknowable. Nuclear's got a real difficult future, just like coal, and that's one of the reasons why. Gas utilities, non-renewable utilities, tend to have higher decommissioning risks because of toxins and pollution and all of those other issues. So again, we just have to ask for a fair accounting.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you would like to know more about the Southern New Mexico New Progressives, my name is Antoinette Reyes. You can meet with me after, and you'll have plenty of time to meet with the candidates. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you to the New Progressives for putting this on. We really appreciate it.
I'm sorry, I almost forgot one last thing. So we had a minute each closing
Oh, closing.
statement. Sorry about that. So we'll begin with Mr. Fishman, so a minute for your closing statement.
So I think the major theme of my candidacy really is that we have to switch the PRC from being largely a reactive to a proactive agency. I think we have a lot of work to do to build the expertise of staff. I think that it's tilted very heavily by the procedures that are currently in place to parties that have lots of resources in order to manipulate the system. And I think large monopoly utilities do a terrific job of that. There are areas of the PRC, like pipelines, that operate well, but there are others that have significant failings, and I think the largest one is, quite frankly, in the electric utility sector. We need to be proactive. We need to look at developments that are happening. We need to look at regulations that are going on in other states. We need to, pardon?
I said if you could finish your thought.
Okay. And we need to set up an environment where we encourage utilities to test and experiment with new technologies rather than run away from them. In the long run, that's incredibly expensive. It's like running a company without an R&D department. Bad, bad, bad idea. Thank you.
Mr. Durham.
Thanks. So, since 2015, utilities have brought to us $505 million worth of requests for rate increases. $118 million of that was rejected on the spot. $387 million has been litigated, and out of that $387 million, $127 million has been awarded to companies. EP's last rate case here asked for $9 million, got $600,000. That decision was written out of my office. That was brought up slightly. One of the things that we increased in there was the employee pension fund. So we wanted to make sure that that was fully funded to protect those employees. Since we've been there, and we talk about in the local, we put in an economic development rate, hoping that we can attract more business to Doñana County. The cost of that comes out of the stockholders' price, not out of consumers. We put in a demand response program where people can participate in that, get paid by the utility to throttle their electricity in those important times. We brought transparency to the fuel purchase power line item of your utility bill. We pulled the renewable energy costs out of that and made a line item for that, strictly for transparency, despite people saying it was opposite. Wasn't the case. And then this year alone, over 1,300 megawatts of renewable energy. I have an order for another 600 on the east side of the state. This commission is very responsive to renewable energy, and we have a particular interest in having that happen in the state. $1 billion worth of investment over on the east side of the state with that 695 megawatts will save ratepayers $1.8 billion over the next 20 years. Those are significant pieces. Those are significant pieces of renewable energy. And I think the commission is doing every bit that they can. And I will not let anyone talk about our staff being incompetent or their inability. We have some of the finest staff people I've ever seen. Our hearing examiners are recognized all over the United States for the quality of their work. And because of them, it makes commissioners' job a lot easier.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So we just,
So, yeah, so people are more than welcome to stay and
By the way, I have copies of the NRRI report. If folks want to see, what is that?
get that, I got a letter that's going to respond to that. As far as